5 words, said before your feet hit the floor. That's the entire video, one short sentence repeated every single morning that quietly rewires how you handle a brutal email, a cancelled plan, a diagnosis, a stranger's opinion of you, a version of your own future you haven't even lived yet. Picture the person who reads something cruel and just doesn't flinch. Not because they went numb, not because they stopped caring, because they built something almost nobody bothers to build in the 5 quiet minutes right after waking up, before the world gets a vote in how their day goes. And later I'm going to show you exactly why doing this the obvious way, as a mantra, a vibe, a line taped to a mirror, actually makes everything worse, not better, for most people who try it. Comment the word control right now if you want the real mechanism today, not the poster version. You wake up. Before your eyes even adjust to the light in the room, your hand is already reaching for the phone on the nightstand. That's not really a choice. It's a groove worn into your behavior by a few thousand repetitions. The same way a footpath gets worn into grass by people who never planned to make a path, they just kept walking the same line. The first thing that hits you most mornings isn't sunlight, isn't your own thoughts, isn't a plan for the day. It's information delivered by strangers, algorithms, and a handful of people whose moods you're now about to inherit before you've said a single word out loud. A message from your boss, terse, impossible to read the tone of, sitting there since 11 p.m. the night before. A group chat that clearly kept going after you went to bed, full of jokes you weren't part of. A headline built by someone whose entire job is making sure you can't look away from it. And already, before you've brushed your teeth, your nervous system has made a dozen small invisible decisions about how today is allowed to feel. Then the actual day starts, and it doesn't slow down from there. Traffic backs up on the one route you always take, and your jaw tightens over something that has nothing to do with you personally and everything to do with several thousand other people also trying to get somewhere at the same time. You get to work, or you open your laptop at the kitchen table, and someone mentions a decision that was already made in a meeting you weren't invited to. A small, quiet voice starts running in the background of your mind, wondering what that means, wondering if it means anything at all, wondering if you're being quietly phased out of something you didn't even know you were part of. Somebody takes credit for an idea that was yours, phrased almost word for word the way you said it 3 days earlier, and you watch heads nod around the table like it's the first time anyone in the room has heard it. You say nothing in the moment. You go back to your desk or your car or your kitchen table and you replay it for the rest of the afternoon, rewriting the scene in your head, handing yourself the sharp, perfect comeback you didn't have 30 seconds ago when it actually mattered. By the time evening comes, you're carrying the weight of a dozen small events that individually meant almost nothing and collectively mean you snap at someone you love over a dish left in the sink, or a comment made without much thought, or a plan they forgot about. You know, even as it's happening, that the size of your reaction doesn't match the size of the event. You can feel the gap between the two. That gap between what actually happened and how much of you it took is the entire story of this video. That gap is where your peace, your patience, and honestly your personality are quietly leaking out a little each day until you look up one evening and wonder where the calmer, more generous version of yourself went. This is the tax almost nobody notices they're paying. Not money, attention, energy, self-respect. Withdrawn from you in small amounts all day long until by 9 at night you're staring at the ceiling wondering where your hobbies went, wondering why you feel tired in a way that has nothing to do with physical exertion. Add to that the quieter, slower version of the same text, the financial worry that sits in the back of your mind on a Sunday night, the ache of watching a parent get older and less steady on their feet, the low hum of comparing your own timeline to everyone else's, whether they've bought a house, gotten married, had a kid, gotten the job. None of these are dramatic on their own. Together, unmanaged, they add up to a life spent reacting instead of a life spent choosing. Widen the lens for a second, because this isn't just a workday problem. It's a Sunday night problem too. You lie in bed running numbers that don't add up the way you'd like, checking a balance you already know, doing the same math you did last Sunday and the Sunday before that, as if repeating the math enough times might change the answer. You call a parent and notice, this time, a small hesitation in their voice, a slight unsteadiness on the stairs you can hear through the phone even though you can't see it, and some part of you starts quietly grieving a loss that hasn't happened yet, borrowing sorrow from a future that may still be years away. None of this is weakness, it's what an untrained mind does by default. When it's handed uncertainty, it fills the gap with worst cases on a loop for free, whether or not you asked it to. Zoom back in for a moment, because it's not only the big occasional stressors doing this to you, it's the small, constant ones stacking silently underneath them. A text left on read for 6 hours that probably meant nothing and got turned by evening into a whole theory about whether the friendship is fading. A calendar notification for a dentist appointment you forgot about, which shouldn't matter, it somehow ruins the next 20 minutes anyway. Your whole morning suddenly reorganized around a small inconvenience. None of these individually would make a good story if you told it to a friend. That's exactly the problem. They're too small to talk about, too frequent to ignore, and they add up anyway, quietly in a column nobody's keeping track of except your own nervous system. Marcus Aurelius, a man who ran an empire, buried people he loved, and still found time before sunrise to write himself private notes that nobody was ever supposed to read, kept circling back to one idea more than almost any other in the whole of his private journal. It is not the event itself that disturbs you. It's the judgment you silently attach to it, usually within a fraction of a second, usually so fast that you don't even notice you did it, so fast that it feels like the disturbance and the event arrived at the exact same moment, glued together, inseparable. The traffic is neutral, the rerouted meeting is neutral, the dish in the sink is neutral. What turns a string of neutral facts into a ruined evening is a verdict you handed down before you'd even finished processing what actually happened. He wasn't telling himself to pretend nothing happened or that nothing mattered. He was pointing again and again at the half second right after the event, the half second where a choice still technically exists, the half second almost everyone on earth sleepwalks straight through without noticing it was ever there. Here's the core idea, and it's genuinely smaller than you're expecting, which is exactly why most people underestimate it the first time they hear it. Every morning, before you check your phone, before you speak to another human being, before the day gets its hooks fully into you, you say 5 words out loud if you're alone, silently if you're not. I do not control this. Not as a chant you mumble on the way to the coffee machine, not as a vibe you post about and then forget the second real friction shows up. As a genuine repeated act of sorting the world, firsting into what's actually yours to move and what was never yours to move in the first place, no matter how much energy you throw at it. Let's be precise about what this does not mean, because this is exactly where most people quietly misfire and then a few weeks later conclude the whole idea was empty. It does not mean apathy. It does not mean giving up on your goals, lowering your standards, or becoming someone who just absorbs whatever life throws at them without response. It does not mean becoming passive, agreeable, easy to walk over, easy to disappoint on purpose because you'll just shrug it off. A person who has genuinely internalized this tends to be more decisive than the people around them, not less because they've stopped burning energy gripping outcomes they never had a hand on in the first place, and they've got that energy left over, fully available for the parts of the situation that were always theirs to move. This isn't resignation dressed up in nicer language, it's redirection, and redirection takes more discipline than gripping everything ever did. There's a second objection worth naming directly, because if I don't, you'll be sitting with it silently for the rest of this video instead of listening. Doesn't this just excuse people from taking responsibility for their own mistakes? No, the 5 words are not a blanket statement about the entire situation. They're a scalpel applied specifically to the parts of a situation that were never yours to begin with. If you missed the deadline because you procrastinated, that's yours fully, and no amount of saying I do not control this changes that fact or should be used to dodge it. What you don't control is how your boss reacts to the news, whether they forgive it quickly or hold on to it, whether a client notices or doesn't. You still own the mistake. You just stop also trying to own everyone else's reaction to it, which was never available to you regardless of how well you apologize. And it stands in direct, quiet opposition to something our entire culture rewards loudly, constantly, in almost every feed you scroll through. We live inside a message that says, if you just visualize hard enough, hustle hard enough, manifest hard enough, grind hard enough, you can force reality into whatever shape you've decided it should take. That message feels powerful the first time you hear it. It feels like agency, like finally being handed the steering wheel. What it actually produces for most people who take it fully literally is a low, constant hum of anxiety underneath everything, because you're white-knuckling a grip on 100 things that were never structurally yours to grip at all. Other people's opinions of you, the market, the weather, whether your adult kid calls you back this week, whether a biopsy comes back clean, whether a stranger on the internet decides to be kind or cruel in the comments. Gripping harder on things you never controlled doesn't give you more control over them. It just costs you more every single day for a return of 0. Level 1 is your phone, and it's the easiest starting point because it's the most repeatable. You get a fresh shot at practicing this literally every single day, sometimes 50 separate times a day, which means 50 separate reps at a skill most people never deliberately train even once. Picture the scroll. Not one specific app, just the motion itself, thumb up, thumb up, thumb up, a parade of other people's vacations, promotions, renovated kitchens, engagement announcements, and confident opinions delivered to you in a sequence engineered by people who are paid, specifically and very well, to keep your thumb moving for as long as possible. Nobody in that feed asked to become your measuring stick for how your own life is going. And yet, within roughly 4 seconds of opening it, some quiet internal committee in your head has already started comparing your kitchen to their kitchen, your relationship to their curated highlight reel of a relationship, your ordinary Tuesday to somebody else's best day of the year, filmed and edited to look like every day. Epictetus, who spent part of his early life enslaved before going on to become one of the most influential teachers in the ancient world, opened his entire surviving body of teaching with almost exactly this split. Some things are up to us, our own judgments, our own choices, our own reactions to what happens. Most things are not up to us, other people's opinions, their bodies, their choices, whether they approve of us or not. He taught that the overwhelming majority of human misery comes down to one simple repeated category error, treating things from the second group as though they belonged in the first, then feeling betrayed by the world when they refuse to cooperate. You don't control the feed, you don't control who posts what, when or how carefully it's been edited before it reaches you. You do control whether you open it the instant you wake up, and you do control the several seconds of judgment that fire immediately after you do. The psychological name for what's actually firing in your brain during that early morning scroll is social comparison theory, a well-documented, thoroughly studied tendency for people to evaluate their own worth and their own life by measuring it against other people, especially in moments where there's no objective yardstick available. Your brain does this automatically, instinctively, the same way it flinches from a sudden loud noise nearby. It's not a character flaw unique to you, it's wiring, shared by essentially everyone who has ever opened a feed. But wiring that fires without your permission at 7 in the morning before you've said a single word to another human being all day is wiring that is currently steering the opening minutes of your entire day for you without asking. Here's the reframe, and I want you to actually let this land instead of just nodding along. The feed was never a mirror, it was never measuring you, never designed to reflect your actual life back at you accurately. It's noise dressed up carefully to look like a mirror, because noise dressed up as a mirror is extremely effective at keeping you scrolling for another 11 minutes. The moment you genuinely believe that, not just repeat it, actually believe it in your body, the entire comparison engine loses its grip on you, because you cannot lose a comparison you never agreed to enter in the first place. The action is almost embarrassingly small, and that's precisely why most people skip it and go looking for something more complicated instead. Say the 5 words before you unlock the screen, not after. I do not control this. Then unlock it if you still want to. You'll notice something interesting happen the first handful of times you actually do this. The words create a small gap, maybe 2 seconds between waking up and reacting on autopilot, and that gap is the entire mechanism this whole video is built around. If you want a second layer to this, once the first version feels automatic, try naming out loud, specifically what you actually do control in that same instant, not this feed, but my attention, not the stranger's opinion, but my next hour. That second sentence is optional, but it turns the exercise from purely defensive into something closer to steering. 2 seconds, repeated daily, compounding quietly over weeks until it stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like who you are. It shows up off the phone too, in smaller ways you might not have labeled as the same pattern. You walk past a neighbor's new car in the driveway and feel a small, uninvited pinch in your chest before you've even registered whose car it is. You hear that a friend from college got a promotion, a title, a number attached to a salary, and some old involuntary part of you starts quietly measuring your own timeline against theirs, as if there were one correct pace everyone was supposed to be moving at. This is the exact same wiring as the scroll, just wearing a different outfit. The 5 words apply here with zero modification. I do not control their car, their title, their pace. You're not being asked to stop noticing these things. You're being asked to notice them, name them, and let them pass through instead of setting up camp. There's a specific trap worth naming here before we move on, because it catches a lot of people right at this early stage. Some viewers will hear "I do not control this" and quietly turn it into an excuse to stop trying, to stop applying for the job, stop having the hard conversation, stop showing up to the gym, because I don't control the outcome anyway, so what's the point? That's a misreading, and it's an important one to catch early, because it poisons every level that follows. You don't control whether you get the job, you absolutely control whether you send the application. You don't control whether the relationship works out, you completely control whether you show up honestly inside it. The 5 words were never permission to stop acting. They were permission to stop white-knuckling the part of the outcome that was never yours, so you can put your full, undivided effort into the part that always was. Now we raise the stakes, because level 1 was almost too easy, and easy is exactly where most videos like this one stop, right before it gets useful. Level 2 moves off the phone entirely and into a room with another human being in it, which changes everything, because now there's a witness to whatever you do next. Picture a Monday morning meeting. You actually prepared for this one, stayed up later than you meant to, refining a proposal you were genuinely proud of walking in. Partway through, a coworker rephrases your exact idea, almost word for word, with a little more confidence in their voice than you had. The room reacts like it's the first time anyone has heard it. Heads nod. Someone says "great point" out loud. Your name never comes up, not once, not even in passing. You feel your face get hot, that specific heat that starts around your collar and climbs toward your ears, and every part of you wants to interrupt right there, to correct the record in front of everyone, to say the obvious thing out loud. That's what I said 5 minutes ago. Seneca, writing a long letter to a friend on the subject of anger, made an observation that still holds up perfectly 2,000 years later. Anger feels like strength in the exact moment you're feeling it, and it costs you dearly by evening, once the heat has faded and you're left looking honestly at what it made you say or do. He wasn't arguing for suppression, pretending you're fine when you're clearly not, just moves the cost somewhere else in your body, usually somewhere that shows up later as a headache or a sleepless night. He was arguing for a pause, long enough to actually see the situation clearly before you act from the heat instead of from your own considered judgment. What's actually happening in your chest during that meeting has a specific, well-studied name: cognitive dissonance, the particular discomfort that shows up when two beliefs you hold about yourself collide and refuse to sit quietly together. One belief: I am the competent, capable person in this room. The second belief, freshly delivered by the room itself, in real time, in front of everyone. Apparently that's not what just got recognized. Your brain hates holding both of those at once and wants relief immediately, which is exactly why the urge to interrupt feels so urgent, so physically necessary, almost like releasing pressure from a valve that's about to blow. Here's the reframe: you do not control what that room saw, or how fast they connected the dots, or whether they ever hand you credit at all, publicly or privately. You never did control that, not for 1 second, no matter how good the work was. What you actually control is whether you're still the person who does excellent work tomorrow and the week after and the month after that, regardless of who got the nod in one specific meeting on one specific Monday. Competence that only feels real when it's witnessed in the moment by exactly the right people is competence built on sand, and sand shifts. Say the 5 words under your breath: I do not control this, before you respond, and then respond from the clear-headed version of you instead of the hot-faced version. Sometimes that response is a calm, private conversation afterward, one sentence, no drama. Sometimes it's simply letting it go entirely and letting your body of work speak for itself over months instead of over one meeting. Either way, it's now a choice you're making on purpose, not a reaction you're being dragged into. This same heat shows up in smaller professional moments too, the ones that never make it into a story you tell anyone later. An email lands with a tone you can't quite pin down, too short maybe, or missing the exclamation point it usually has, and you spend 45 minutes of your actual day drafting and redrafting 3 sentences in response, passing punctuation like it's a legal document. That 45 minutes is gone now, permanently spent defending against the threat that 9 times out of 10 was never actually there. I do not control the tone in someone else's head when they type that sentence. I control whether I spend my morning defending against a guess. There's also a version of this that shows up in performance reviews, and it's worth naming because it's one of the few moments a year where the stakes feel officially, institutionally real. You sit across from a manager who delivers feedback in a tone that's clinical, maybe even a little cold, and your mind immediately starts building a story about what it means for your job security, your future at the company, your worth as an employee, all from a 15-minute conversation. Most of that story is manufactured after the fact, assembled from a handful of neutral words and a lot of your own fear filling in the rest. You do not control the tone your manager happens to have on a Tuesday afternoon, or whatever they've got going on that has nothing to do with you. You control what you do with the specific concrete feedback once you've separated it from the tone it arrived in. Quick pattern interrupt, because I want you actually here with me for this, not half listening while you fold laundry in another room. Have you ever noticed you rehearse arguments with people who aren't even physically present? Entire conversations complete with their comeback and your perfect devastating response to their comeback running on a loop while you're doing dishes or driving or trying to fall asleep. Everyone does this. It's not weakness, and it's not a sign something's wrong with you specifically. It's an unmanaged nervous system running old, unfinished software, replaying a scene because some part of you is still trying uselessly to resolve it after the fact. The 5 words work here too. Mid-rehearsal, the exact second you catch yourself doing it. I do not control what they think of me. Say it and watch the loop actually lose momentum, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes so abruptly it surprises you. Level 3 moves off the phone, off the meeting room, and into somewhere most people guard even more carefully than their professional reputation, a relationship with someone they genuinely love. Picture this. Someone close to you, a partner, a close friend, it doesn't really matter which, starts pulling back in small increments at first, so small you almost talk yourself out of noticing. Texts get shorter, plans get cancelled with a vague excuse instead of a real one, calls that used to happen every few days without either of you scheduling them just stop happening at all. You don't know why. You start constructing theories, most of them significantly worse than whatever is actually going on, because an unexplained absence is one of the most uncomfortable vacuums the human mind is capable of sitting inside, and the mind will fill a vacuum with almost anything rather than leave it empty. Attachment theory, one of the most extensively researched frameworks in modern psychology, tells us this reaction runs ancient and deep, a felt sense of abandonment that your body treats as genuinely physically dangerous, a threat to your survival, even when the actual present-day stakes amount to someone being quiet for a week or two. That's not an exaggeration for the sake of the video. Your nervous system doesn't fully distinguish between person I love has gone emotionally distant and person I depend on for survival has actually vanished. It reacts to both scenarios with a version of the exact same internal alarm. That's why a single cancelled dinner can leave you lying awake at 11 at night, mind racing through scenarios that have almost nothing to do with the true, modest size of the actual event. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself over and over, across years of private writing meant for no eyes but his own, that other people act according to their own nature, their own history, their own bandwidth, their own unresolved things happening beneath the surface, not according to yours, and being shocked by that every single time it happens is a quiet, entirely self-inflicted punishment you hand yourself over and over for free. He wasn't telling himself to stop caring about the people around him. He was telling himself to stop being surprised again and again that other people are also fully independent human beings carrying their own private weather that has nothing to do with him. You do not control their mood, their bandwidth, their unresolved history, or the timeline on which they choose to process whatever they're currently processing. What you control is whether you spiral into 3 days of anxious guessing and rehearsed worst-case conversations, or whether you stay steady, ask one direct and kind question, and let their actual answer be the answer instead of building an entire elaborate narrative inside the silence they've left behind. Say the 5 words before you send the 4th follow-up text they haven't asked for. Let your steadiness be the invitation, not the demand, because demand, even when it's disguised as concern, tends to push people further away, while genuine steadiness tends to give them room to come back toward you on their own timeline, which is usually the only timeline that actually works anyway. This isn't only about romantic distance either. Picture a teenager in your house who used to tell you everything and now answers in single words, door mostly closed, headphones in more often than not. It's easy to read that as rejection, aimed specifically at you, and spiral into guessing what you did wrong. Some of it might be about you. Most of it is a normal, well-documented developmental stage, a young person doing the necessary work of separating their identity from their parents, which is supposed to happen, and which says far less about your parenting than it feels like it does in the moment. I do not control the pace of someone else's growing up. I control whether I stay warm and available at the door they've left slightly open, instead of either forcing it wider or letting my hurt feelings close it the rest of the way. Friendship carries its own version of this, quieter and slower moving than romance, which is exactly what makes it easy to miss until it's already happened. A friendship you used to lean on starts fading, not through any single fight or falling out, just through the ordinary drift of different schedules, different seasons of life, one of you having kids while the other doesn't, one of you moving city. There's no villain in that story, which somehow makes it harder to sit with than a clean betrayal would be. There's nobody to be angry at, just distance accumulating quietly. You do not control the pull of someone else's circumstances, their new job, their new baby, their new city. You control whether you're the one who occasionally reaches out anyway, without keeping score of who reached out last time. Level 4 is sharper still, and this is where the phrase stops being a tidy mindset trick and starts becoming something closer to armor. Picture a waiting room, fluorescent light overhead, old magazines nobody actually reads, a strange result from a routine test that your doctor's office called about in a tone just slightly too careful, too measured, too obviously trained to sound calm. You don't have information yet. What you have is the absence of information, and the mind will happily fill that absence with the worst-case scenario, rendered in full, unwanted detail, unprompted, usually right around 3 in the morning. Seneca rehearsed loss deliberately, and often not as some grim, morbid habit meant to darken his mood, but because he understood something very specific and very practical. Unrehearsed fear is the loudest, most disorienting kind of fear there is. A threat you've never once let yourself imagine, even briefly, hits you completely unarmored all at once with nothing to soften the blow. A threat you've sat with, even uncomfortably, even for a few minutes, in the calm of an ordinary morning, has already lost some meaningful fraction of its ambush power by the time it actually shows up in real life on a Tuesday, in a waiting room like this one. Psychologically, this is a form of exposure in miniature, the well-documented pattern where deliberately, briefly facing a feared thought in a controlled, low-stakes setting measurably reduces its power to blindside you later, compared to spending all your available energy avoiding the thought entirely, pushing it away every time it surfaces. Avoidance feels protective in the moment it happens. It is actually what keeps the fear fully loaded and untouched. Sitting there ready to detonate the instant reality finally forces your hand on its schedule instead of yours. The reframe here is not "don't worry, everything will be fine," because you genuinely don't know that yet, and false reassurance tends to collapse the second real stress actually arrives and proves it wrong. The reframe is, "I do not control the results sitting in that folder. I control how I meet the next hour while I wait for it, whether I spend it catastrophizing alone in a plastic chair, or whether I spend it calling someone who loves me, going for a short walk outside afterward, doing the next small ordinary right thing directly in front of me instead of the imagined worst case thing 3 steps down a road that hasn't even happened yet and may never happen at all." Say the 5 words in the waiting room chair quietly to yourself. Let them be the actual difference between the version of you that suffers the entire way twice, once in imagination, once for real, and the version that gets through it once, cleanly, whatever the result turns out to be. The same waiting room logic applies to job security, and this one hits almost everyone eventually. Layoff rumors move through an office like weather, and one morning you notice a closed-door meeting you weren't invited to, and your stomach drops before you have a single fact in hand. You cannot control the spreadsheet a decision is being made from 3 floors up, the market conditions behind it, or the timing of an announcement that hasn't happened yet. What you control is showing up fully to the work in front of you today, keeping your own resume and your own options quietly current regardless of what happens, and refusing to spend 6 imagined weeks in advance grieving a job you might still have on Friday. Say the 5 words at your desk, then do the next real task in front of you. Money itself deserves its own moment here, because for a lot of people it's the quietest, most constant version of this whole pattern, running in the background of nearly every decision. You don't control the broader economy, interest rates, inflation, whether the market is up or down on any given Tuesday, or what a company 3 states away decides about your industry. What you control is what you actually do with the dollars that pass through your hands, what you save, what you spend, what conversations you have about it instead of avoiding them. A lot of financial anxiety isn't really about the numbers. It's about the sensation of being at the mercy of forces you can't see or touch. And the 5 words don't fix your bank balance, but they do stop you from spending your Sunday night suffering over a stock market you were never going to move anyway. Parenting carries its own version of this, and it catches a lot of people off guard because it's supposed to be the one area where love alone is enough, and it often isn't, not by itself. You watch a child struggle with something, friendships, grades, a sport they used to love and suddenly don't, and every instinct in your body wants to reach in and fix it directly, immediately, on your timeline instead of theirs. Some of that is genuinely yours to shape. A meaningful amount of it isn't, and pretending otherwise usually produces a kid who either resents the interference or never develops the ability to solve problems on their own because you kept solving them first. I do not control who my child becomes, only the environment, the modeling, and the door I leave open. That's a harder sentence to sit with than most of the others in this video, and it might also be one of the truest. If you've made it this far, you already think differently than most people watching this video. Most viewers bail well before the real mechanics show up, and you didn't. Do me one genuine favor and tap like right now, because that single action is what actually tells this video to reach the people who need this second half even more than you might. And that backfiring I mentioned all the way back at the start, the reason doing this the obvious way quietly ruins it for almost everyone who tries, that's coming up in just a few minutes, and it might be the single most important idea in this entire script. Before we get there, one more honest note on where most people are right now watching this, somewhere between "this makes sense" and "I still don't actually believe it'll work for me." That gap is normal, and it's worth naming instead of pretending it isn't there. Understanding an idea intellectually and actually living inside it are 2 different skills built on 2 different timelines. You can nod along with everything said so far and still catch yourself spiraling tomorrow morning over something small, and that doesn't mean any of this failed. It means you're exactly where everyone starts, including the people who eventually get good at this. The only real difference between them and everyone else isn't that they never spiral, it's that they catch it faster each time, and the 5 words are the tool that speeds up the catching. This is mortality, not in the distant, abstract philosophy class sense, but in the specific, ordinary sense of an aging parent who's a little less steady on the stairs than they were last year, a friend roughly your own age who didn't wake up one morning. A quiet, persistent awareness sitting somewhere in the back of your mind that your own clock is running whether you choose to look at it or not. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself repeatedly across years that death isn't something waiting patiently at the far end of your life, some distant event to worry about later. It's happening in small installments the entire time you're alive, each single day a small piece of the total spent and gone, permanently, never reissued, never refunded. He didn't write that to be bleak or to darken his own mood on purpose, He wrote it because he'd noticed something intensely practical over years of observing himself and the people around him. People who genuinely internalize their own mortality tend to stop wasting their remaining days on grudges, on status games, on rehearsing arguments with people who wronged them years earlier and are barely thinking about it anymore. Not because mortality makes those things unimportant in some grand cosmic sense, but because it makes them obviously, viscerally, not worth the hours they're currently costing. The psychological framing here is sometimes called mortality salience, a well-documented shift in behavior and stated priorities that occurs when death becomes cognitively present and real, rather than a distant abstraction filed away somewhere you don't have to look at it. People who briefly, deliberately sit with their own mortality tend to report noticeably clearer values afterward, a sharper, more honest sense of what actually matters to them versus what was just noise they'd been carrying around out of pure habit, never once questioned. This isn't a call to spend your mornings in dread, and it's not meant to leave you anxious for the rest of the day. It's closer to the opposite. It's a call to let that awareness do the sorting for you, once on purpose, in the calm of a morning, instead of avoiding it entirely and letting it do the sorting anyway, unconsciously, in the quieter form of chronic, low-grade anxiety you can never quite name or locate. I do not control how much time I have. I control what I do with the part that's mine today, specifically right now. That's the 5 words at their absolute outer limit, at the very edge of what they were ever built to hold, and it's also where they do their single most important work, because if the phrase can carry you steadily through this, the largest thing any of us ever have to carry, it can carry you through absolutely everything smaller than it, without exception. There's a reason this level comes last instead of first, and it's not just about escalating stakes for the sake of the video. It's that most people can only actually hear this one after they've practiced the earlier smaller levels first. Someone who hasn't trained the muscle on their phone, their meetings, their relationships, and their waiting rooms will hear you don't control how much time you have and experience it as bleak, something to look away from as fast as possible. Someone who spent even a few weeks practicing the smaller releases hears the exact same sentence completely differently, not as a threat, but as the most honest permission slip they've ever been handed, to stop postponing the parts of their life that actually matter until some more convenient, more certain future date that was never guaranteed to arrive in the first place. There's a quieter version of this level too, one that doesn't involve a hospital at all. It's the ordinary, accumulating loss of time itself, a childhood you can't rewind, a decade you spent chasing something that turned out not to matter as much as you thought it would, a relationship that ended years ago that you still occasionally replay looking for the moment you could have fixed it. None of that is available for revision. Seneca pointed out that people are careful, even stingy with their money, and reckless, almost careless with the one resource they can never get back or earn more of their days. I do not control the years already spent, I control the ones still in front of me, starting with this one. There's a specific exercise worth naming here. One Stoic writers came back to often, sometimes called viewing things from above, imagining your life briefly from a great height, the way you might look down at a map and watch yourself as one small figure moving through a single ordinary day, inside a single ordinary decade, inside a life that will eventually end like every life that came before it. It sounds abstract until you actually try it, standing in your kitchen for 30 seconds and notice how quickly the argument you were about to have over something small starts to shrink in size. Not because it stops mattering entirely, because it gets correctly sized for the first time all day against the actual scale of your life instead of the artificially inflated scale a stressful morning hands you by default. And here's the paradox, the exact backfiring I promised you all the way back at the start. Most people who try this technique treat it like nothing more than a mantra. They chant the 5 words on total autopilot while still, underneath, gripping the outcome exactly as tightly as they were before they ever heard this video. They say, I do not control this about the promotion, while refreshing their email every 11 minutes anyway, phone in hand, stomach tight. They say it out loud about the relationship while still constructing the anxious, detailed narrative inside the silence, word for word, scene by scene. And for these people, it does nothing at all. Nothing. Because the words without the actual release behind them are just more noise stacked directly on top of the same old grip, dressed up to look like progress. And eventually, a few weeks in, they quietly conclude the whole idea was hollow, another piece of content that sounded good in the moment and changed absolutely nothing about their actual life. The 5 words only work in the exact moment you genuinely mean them, the specific moment you stop performing calm for your own benefit and start actually practicing it, which is a completely different, far more demanding thing than it sounds like from the outside. Performing calm is simply saying the sentence out loud and moving on. Practicing calm is noticing your own hand still reaching for the phone at the 11-minute mark, catching it mid-motion and consciously choosing not to open it, even though every part of you wants to. That's the entire, complete difference between the 1% who say these 5 words and genuinely mean them, and the much larger group who say them out loud every morning and still feel exactly the same by lunchtime, wondering why nothing worked. Here's how you can tell honestly which group you're actually in, because most people assume they're in the first group without ever checking. Watch what happens the next time something goes sideways, not what you say, what your body does. Does your jaw stay tight for the next 3 hours after you've said the words, or does it actually release? Do you still reach for your phone 40 times in the next hour to check on the thing you claim to release, or does the checking noticeably slow down? The words are a door, not a room. Saying them opens the door. Whether you actually walk through it, into the calmer, less gripping version of the moment, is a separate action entirely, one that has to be repeated imperfectly for weeks before it starts to feel like less of an effort and more like your default setting. This is also why the 7-day challenge at the end of this video matters more than it sounds like it should for something this simple. One morning of saying 5 words changes almost nothing measurable. You could say them once, feel a small flicker of relief, and go right back to your old patterns by lunch, and that would prove nothing either way. What changes something is the version of you who says it on the 3rd day when nothing dramatic has happened yet to reward the effort, and again on the 5th day when it started to feel a little repetitive, and again on the 7th, at which point it's no longer a technique you're trying. It's closer to a reflex you've built, the same way any other reflex gets built through unglamorous, unremarkable repetition, not through a single moment of insight, however good that moment felt while you were having it. You wake up and the chaos hasn't gone anywhere at all, the messages are still sitting there, the traffic is still backed up on the same stretch of road, the uncertain result is still waiting on your phone, the person you love is still occasionally distant for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with you personally. None of that disappears, and this video was never promising that it would. What disappears is the 4-second detonation that used to follow automatically, replaced now by a 2-second pause where you actually get to choose your next move instead of being dragged into it. You read the cold email and respond in a single calm sentence instead of a defensive paragraph because you're no longer writing from the hot-faced version of yourself. You sit in the waiting room and it's still technically a waiting room, but it's no longer eating you alive from the inside while you sit there. You watch someone else get credit for your idea and it stings for exactly as long as it should sting, and then it's gone because you're not carrying it into the next 3 meetings anymore. People around you start to notice something they can't fully name, that you're harder to rattle than you used to be, slower to snap, somehow steadier in exactly the rooms that used to knock you sideways every single time. The world doesn't get quieter, the traffic doesn't disappear, the uncertainty doesn't resolve itself just because you're calmer about it. You do. You're the thing that gets quieter, and that turns out to be the only part that was ever actually within reach. 6 months from now, this looks like ordinary days that used to be extraordinary in the worst way. A cancelled flight used to cost you the whole afternoon in frustration. Now it costs you 20 minutes and a rebooked ticket. A hard conversation with a parent used to leave you rattled for days. Now it leaves you tired maybe, but intact, because you walked in already knowing you couldn't control their reaction, only your own honesty. You start noticing other people's storms from a slight distance, not because you stopped caring what happens to you, but because you're no longer standing directly inside every single one of them, soaked through every time. That distance isn't coldness. It's the room you needed all along to actually help the people around you instead of drowning alongside them. A year from now, this looks like a version of you that other people quietly start seeking out during their own hard moments, not because you have all the answers, but because you're no longer adding your own panic to theirs. Someone on your team comes to you specifically when a project falls apart because you're the one who doesn't make it worse. A friend calls you first when their world tilts sideways because you've become someone who can sit inside someone else's chaos without needing to fix it immediately or absorb it as your own. You still feel things fully, the sadness, the frustration, the fear. You do not perform stillness while secretly falling apart underneath it. The actual stillness is real, earned through months of 2-second pauses, stacked one on top of another until they became who you are instead of something you occasionally remember to do. You wake up, you say the 5 words, the day comes at you exactly the way it always did, and for the first time in a long time, you meet it instead of getting run over by it. For the next 7 days, before your feet even touch the floor, before the phone, before a single word to anyone else in your house, say the 5 words not as a chant, not as a performance for yourself, but as a genuine release. I do not control this. That's the entire rewire this video promised you at the start, and it fits inside one breath, which is exactly why almost nobody believes it's enough the first time they hear it. If you're actually committing to this for the next 7 days, not just watching and nodding along, comment the word control below right now so I know you're genuinely in. And if any part of this shifted something in you today, subscribe, because next week's video breaks down exactly what to do with the part you actually do control once you finally stopped wasting all your energy on the part you never did. One last thing before you go, because I don't want you to walk away from this thinking the 5 words are a cure for every hard day, or that you'll say them once tomorrow morning and wake up permanently changed. You won't. You'll forget on day 3, probably catch yourself scrolling before you've said anything at all, and that's not failure, that's just what building any real habit actually looks like from the inside, messy and inconsistent long before it's smooth. The goal was never perfection. It was a slightly wider gap between what happens to you and how you respond to it, repeated often enough that it eventually stops requiring effort at all. Start tomorrow, start small, say the 5 words, mean them as best you can that day, and let tomorrow be a little easier than today, and the day after that a little easier still. That's the whole practice. Stay grounded,